The phone rang at 12:17 a.m. on a Tuesday night, slicing through the silence of our Cedar Heights home like a blade through fabric. I knew before I even looked at the screen that something was catastrophically wrong. Parents develop this instinct, this awful knowing that arrives in your gut seconds before your brain catches up. Claire's name glowed on the display, but when I answered, the voice that came through wasn't my confident, ambitious daughter who'd moved to Portland 3 months ago to start her dream job at the prestigious environmental consulting firm Cascade Solutions. This voice was shattered glass, each word cutting through the phone line with raw desperation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Dad, she whispered, and I could hear her trying to control her breathing, failing. I need you to know what they did to me before I disappear completely. I was already reaching for my car keys before she finished the sentence, my bare feet hitting the cold hardwood floor of our bedroom. My wife Helen stirred beside me, her eyes opening with that same parental alarm that had woken me. Claire had always been our rock, the daughter who called us every Sunday at exactly 2 p.m., who sent thoughtful care packages during finals week in college, who never once in her 25 years had called us crying in the middle of the night. Claire, sweetheart, slow down. Tell me what happened, I said, trying to keep my voice steady while my hands fumbled with my jeans in the dark. Helen was already sitting up, her face pale in the glow of my phone screen. They destroyed everything, Dad. My reputation, my career, my credibility. And the worst part is, I helped them do it. I trusted them with information that I thought was going to help people, and they used it to bury me instead. Her voice cracked on the word, bury, and I heard her take a shuddering breath. Dr. Brennan called me into his office today and told me I was being terminated for falsifying research data. Data that I never even touched. They're saying I manipulated environmental impact reports to favor certain development projects. The words hit me like physical blows. Claire had spent 4 years at Oregon State studying environmental science, graduated summa cum laude, earned her master's degree in environmental policy. She'd turned down 3 other job offers to work at Cascade Solutions because she believed in their mission statement about sustainable development and protecting Oregon's natural resources. She'd been so proud when they hired her, so excited to finally be doing work that mattered. That's impossible, I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew that in Claire's world, impossible meant nothing. I'd seen enough workplace politics in my 30 years as a high school principal to know that truth and justice don't always align with what actually happens to good people. Did you explain to them that you weren't involved in those reports? Claire's laugh was bitter, hollow. Dad, they have documentation. Emails with my name on them. File access logs showing I downloaded sensitive data. Even meeting notes that supposedly show me discussing how to adjust findings to make projects look more environmentally friendly. It's all fake, but it looks real. So real that I started questioning my own memory. I was in the garage now, Helen close behind me, pulling on her coat over her pajamas. We both knew without discussion that we were driving to Portland immediately. This wasn't a phone conversation problem. This was a hold your daughter while she falls apart problem. Where are you right now? I asked, backing out of the driveway while Helen called our neighbor to check on our house. In my apartment. I packed everything today after they escorted me out of the building like I was some kind of criminal. Security watched me clean out my desk, Dad. Everyone in the office just stared. People I thought were my friends couldn't even look at me. She paused, and I heard her blowing her nose. I don't know what to do. They're going to destroy my career before it even starts. Who's going to hire an environmental consultant who's been accused of data manipulation? The 3-hour drive to Portland had never felt longer. Helen spent most of it on her laptop, researching Cascade Solutions, looking up employment law, trying to find some angle that might help. I drove and listened to Claire's story unfold in fragments over the phone. She'd stay on the line for 10 or 15 minutes, telling me about a meeting she'd had with her supervisor Tyler Brooks, or about a project she'd been assigned that seemed strange at the time, or about how her mentor Marcus Thompson had suddenly become cold and distant over the past few weeks. Then she'd hang up to cry, and call back 20 minutes later with another piece of the puzzle. By the time we pulled up to her small apartment building near the Willamette River, A picture was starting to emerge, and it wasn't pretty. Claire had been systematically isolated at work over the past month. Projects she'd been working on were suddenly reassigned. Meetings she was supposed to attend were moved without notice. Her access to certain databases had been restricted, ostensibly for security updates that never seemed to finish. We found her sitting on her couch, surrounded by cardboard boxes, still wearing the professional blazer she'd put on that morning, when she still thought she had a career. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her usually perfect ponytail hanging loose and disheveled. When she saw us, she crumpled, and for the first time since she was a little girl afraid of thunderstorms, my daughter fell apart in my arms. "I keep thinking about what I could have done differently," she whispered into my shoulder. "Maybe if I hadn't asked so many questions about the Riverside Development Project. Maybe if I hadn't pushed back when Tyler told me to approve that impact assessment without doing a full site survey. Maybe if I hadn't gone to Marcus when I noticed irregularities in the data analysis." Helen and I exchanged glances over Claire's head. This wasn't the story of a young employee making rookie mistakes. This was the story of someone who'd stumbled onto something she wasn't supposed to see, and was now paying the price for having integrity. "Tell us about the Riverside Development Project," Helen said gently, settling onto the couch next to Claire with a cup of tea she'd made in the tiny kitchen. Claire sat up, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "It's this massive residential and commercial complex they want to build along the river, about 40 minutes outside the city. Beautiful area, lots of old-growth forest, important salmon spawning grounds. The developer, some company called Northern Vista Holdings, hired Cascade Solutions to do the environmental impact assessment." She pulled out a manila folder from one of the boxes, her hands shaking slightly as she opened it. "When Tyler assigned me to assist with the project, I was thrilled. It was exactly the kind of work I wanted to do. But when I started looking at the preliminary data, nothing made sense. The soil samples showed contamination levels that should have been red flags, but they were being categorized as within acceptable limits. The wildlife surveys were incomplete, missing entire species that I know live in that area because I've hiked there." Claire spread out several documents on her coffee table, pointing to highlighted sections. "Look at this. The report claims they found no evidence of endangered species habitats, but I know for a fact that there's a family of river otters living in that exact stretch of water. I've seen them. I even have photos from when I went camping there last spring." I leaned forward to examine the documents, though most of the technical jargon was beyond my understanding. What I could see clearly was my daughter's handwriting in the margins, neat notes questioning various findings, suggesting additional tests, recommending more comprehensive surveys. "So you brought these concerns to your supervisor?" I asked. To Tyler, yes. And that's when things started getting weird. Claire pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. "He told me I was overthinking things, that I was too new to understand how these assessments work in the real world. He said environmental consulting isn't like academic research, that we have to balance scientific accuracy with practical business considerations." Helen frowned. "That doesn't sound right." It didn't feel right either, so I went to Marcus Thompson, the senior environmental scientist who was supposed to be mentoring me. Marcus had been so supportive when I first started, always willing to answer questions, really encouraging about my ideas. But when I showed him my concerns about the Riverside project, he completely shut down, told me to focus on my assigned tasks and not worry about the bigger picture. Claire got up and walked to her kitchen window, staring out at the dark river below.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
That's when I started keeping my own records. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, so I started documenting everything. Every conversation, every meeting, every time someone told me to ignore data that didn't fit the desired outcome. My chest tightened as I listened to my daughter describe what sounded like systematic corruption, disguised as business as usual. I thought about all the times over the years when Claire had come to me with problems, how she'd always been able to find solutions through hard work and persistence. This felt different. This felt like she was up against something much bigger and more dangerous than she'd realized. "Claire," I said carefully, "do you still have access to any of your work files?" She shook her head. "They cut off my access as soon as they walked me out, But I do have copies of some things on my personal laptop. Notes I took, photos I took during site visits, emails I forwarded to myself because they seemed important. She paused, looking between Helen and me. I know I wasn't supposed to keep copies, but something told me I might need them someday. Helen and I stayed with Claire for the rest of that week, sleeping on her pull-out couch, bringing her meals she was too devastated to make for herself, holding space while she grieved the loss of not just her job, but her faith in the system she'd believed in. During the day, while she slept off the exhaustion of constant crying, Helen and I started our own investigation. We drove out to the Riverside Development Site, a stunning stretch of land along the Willamette River that was currently home to towering Douglas firs, meadows thick with wildflowers, and yes, a family of river otters that played in the shallows while we watched from the bank. It was exactly the kind of place that should be protected, not bulldozed for luxury condominiums and shopping centers. We researched Northern Vista Holdings and discovered it was a subsidiary of a much larger development company with a history of environmental violations in 3 other states. We looked up Tyler Brooks and found that he'd been with Cascade Solutions for less than 2 years, arriving from a consulting firm in California that had been fined repeatedly for falsifying environmental reports. But it was Helen who made the connection that changed everything. She was researching the ownership structure of Northern Vista Holdings when she discovered that one of the company's silent partners was Dr. Richard Brennan, the same Dr. Brennan who had fired Claire for falsifying data. The man who had accused my daughter of corruption was financially invested in the very project she'd been trying to protect the environment from. We sat in Claire's living room that evening, the evidence spread out on her coffee table like pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. Claire stared at the documents in silence for a long time, her expression shifting from devastation to understanding to something I hadn't seen from her in months: determination. "They set me up," she said quietly. "They needed someone to take the blame for approving a fraudulent environmental assessment, so they created a paper trail that made it look like I was the one manipulating data. When I started asking too many questions, I became a liability instead of a useful scapegoat. I watched my daughter's face transform as the pieces fell into place. This was the Claire I knew, the one who'd never backed down from a challenge, who'd spent her childhood rescuing injured birds and organizing neighborhood cleanup days. The grief and self-doubt were still there, but underneath them was something harder and more focused. "What do you want to do?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Claire looked at me with eyes that reminded me of her mother's, steel wrapped in compassion. "I want to stop them, not just for me, but for everyone who's going to be affected when they destroy that ecosystem, and for every other young professional who might get thrown under the bus to cover up their next scheme." That night, as Helen slept on the pull-out couch, Claire and I sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open between us, beginning to plan how a fired environmental consultant and her high school principal father were going to take on a corrupt consulting firm and expose a fraudulent development project. It was 2 a.m. when Claire finally looked up from the screen, her eyes bright with purpose for the first time since we'd arrived. "Dad," she said, "I think I know exactly how to make them pay for what they did." The morning sunlight filtered through Claire's apartment windows, casting long shadows across the scattered documents that had become our evidence map. Helen was already awake, sitting cross-legged on the floor with her laptop balanced on her knees, methodically documenting everything we'd discovered. Claire emerged from her bedroom looking more rested than she had in days, though the dark circles under her eyes told the story of someone who had spent months carrying a burden she didn't fully understand. "I've been thinking about Grace Rodriguez," Claire said, settling down beside the coffee table with a steaming mug. Grace had been Claire's closest friend at Cascade Solutions, another young environmental scientist who'd started around the same time. "She called me yesterday after news of my termination spread through the office. She was crying, Dad. She kept saying she was sorry, that she should have spoken up sooner." Helen looked up from her screen. "Spoken up about what?" Claire wrapped her hands around her mug, staring into the dark liquid as if it might hold answers. Grace said that over the past few months, she'd noticed other employees being pushed out quietly. People who asked too many questions about certain projects, who pushed back on timelines that didn't allow for proper environmental assessments, who suggested modifications that would protect sensitive habitats but might delay development schedules. I felt my stomach tighten. How many people? 3 others in the past 6 months. All environmental scientists, all relatively new employees, all terminated for various ethical violations that seemed to come out of nowhere. Claire pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. There was Jennifer Walsh, who was fired for allegedly accepting gifts from contractors. Michael Santos, terminated for supposedly leaking confidential project information to environmental groups. And David Chen, accused of padding his expense reports. Helen and I exchanged glances. The pattern was becoming clear, and it was uglier than we'd initially realized. Grace also told me something else. Claire continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. She said Tyler Brooks has been asking employees to sign new confidentiality agreements, much more restrictive than the standard employment contracts. Anyone who refuses finds their projects reassigned and their performance reviews suddenly filled with negative comments. I thought about my years as a high school principal, dealing with bullying situations, toxic staff dynamics, systems designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. This felt familiar, but scaled up to a level that could affect entire ecosystems, entire communities. What about Marcus Thompson? Helen asked. You said he'd been supportive initially. Claire's expression darkened. I think Marcus is scared. When I went to him with my concerns about the Riverside project, he looked terrified. Not angry, not dismissive. Terrified. Like I was asking him to do something that could destroy his career. She got up and walked to her bookshelf, pulling out a thick binder filled with printed emails and documents. I started printing everything after that conversation with Marcus. Every email exchange, every project memo, every meeting summary. I had this feeling that digital records could disappear, but paper is harder to erase. For the next several hours, we dove deeper into Claire's documentation. What emerged was a sophisticated system designed to silence dissent and streamline environmental approvals for projects that should never have been approved. Young employees were specifically targeted because they were idealistic enough to care about environmental protection, but inexperienced enough to be easily discredited if they became problems. The scheme was elegantly simple in its cruelty. Environmental consultants like Claire would be assigned to projects with predetermined outcomes. If they completed their assessments without raising concerns, their reports would be used to justify developments that enriched Cascade Solutions' clients. If they identified genuine environmental problems, their concerns would be dismissed as rookie mistakes or academic idealism unsuited for practical consulting work. But if they persisted in raising red flags, if they documented their concerns, or tried to escalate issues through proper channels, they would be systematically undermined. Projects would be reassigned away from them, cutting off their access to the evidence they'd been gathering. Their performance reviews would suddenly reflect issues that had never been mentioned before. Eventually, they'd be terminated for fabricated ethical violations, their reputations destroyed to prevent them from speaking out publicly. Claire had been marked for elimination the moment she started keeping detailed records of the Riverside project's environmental shortcuts. Her dedication to thorough scientific methodology, the very quality that made her an excellent environmental scientist, had made her a liability to people who needed environmental assessments to be rubber stamps rather than genuine evaluations. The thing that makes me angriest, Claire said, sitting back on her heels surrounded by evidence of her own professional destruction, is how they used my integrity against me. They knew I cared about the environment. They knew I'd keep pushing for proper assessments. So they gave me just enough access to uncover problems, then used my attempts to document those problems as evidence that I was the one creating them. Helen had been quiet for most of the morning, but now she looked up from her laptop with an expression I recognized from her years as a legal secretary before Claire was born. Sweetheart, I think we need to talk to some of the other people who were pushed out. If this is really a pattern, then you're not the only one with evidence. That afternoon, we drove across Portland to meet Jennifer Walsh at a small cafe in the Alberta Arts District. Jennifer had been with Cascade Solutions for 8 months before being terminated for allegedly accepting gifts from contractors. She was a soft-spoken woman in her late 20s, with the careful demeanor of someone who'd been burned by trusting the wrong people. I never accepted any gifts, Jennifer said quietly, stirring sugar into her coffee with shaking hands. What happened was, I was working on an assessment for a proposed shopping complex in Gresham. The contractor invited me to lunch to discuss timeline concerns, and I went because I thought it was a normal business meeting. During lunch, his assistant brought in a gift bag and said it was for all the consultants working on the project. She paused, looking out the window at the people walking past on the sidewalk. Inside was a bottle of wine and a gift certificate to a spa, nothing expensive, maybe $60 total. I thought it was a standard client appreciation gesture. But 2 weeks later, Tyler Brooks called me into his office and told me that accepting gifts from contractors was a serious ethical violation. He had photos of me at the lunch, photos of me accepting the gift bag, even a receipt showing the value of the items. Claire leaned forward. "Did you report the lunch meeting to your supervisor beforehand?" "Of course. It's standard protocol. Tyler knew I was going." Jennifer's voice cracked slightly. That's what made it so devastating. He'd approved the meeting, but then used it to destroy my career. I couldn't understand how accepting what I thought was a routine client gift had become grounds for termination. Helen and I listened as Jennifer described the same pattern of isolation and undermining that Claire had experienced. Projects reassigned without explanation, performance reviews that contradicted months of positive feedback, colleagues who suddenly became distant and uncomfortable around her. The worst part, Jennifer continued, was how it affected my family relationships. My parents couldn't understand how I'd been so careless with my career. My boyfriend at the time thought I was hiding something more serious. When you're accused of ethical violations, people assume there's truth to it, even people who love you. We spent 2 hours with Jennifer, documenting her experience and gathering the evidence she'd managed to preserve. When we left, she hugged Claire tightly, tears in both their eyes. "I'm so glad you're fighting back," Jennifer whispered. "I was too scared, too broken. But maybe together we can stop them from doing this to anyone else." Our next stop was Michael Santos, the environmental scientist who'd been accused of leaking confidential information to environmental groups. We found him working at a small nonprofit in Southeast Portland, making a third of what he'd earned at Cascade Solutions but looking more at peace than Jennifer had. Michael's story was even more disturbing than Jennifer's. He discovered that several of Cascade Solutions' assessments had failed to account for wetland areas that were clearly protected under federal environmental regulations. When he'd tried to discuss his concerns with Tyler Brooks, he'd been told that wetland boundaries were, quote, subject to interpretation, and that his job was to provide assessments that allowed projects to move forward, not to create obstacles. "I kept pushing," Michael said, leaning back in his desk chair in the nonprofit's cramped office space. "I couldn't understand how we could call ourselves environmental consultants if we weren't actually protecting the environment, so I started researching the regulatory framework, trying to understand if I was missing something." What Michael had discovered was that Cascade Solutions was systematically misclassifying wetlands to avoid triggering federal protection requirements. Areas that clearly met the criteria for protected wetlands were being categorized as transitional zones or seasonally dry areas to allow development to proceed. When I documented my findings and requested a meeting with Dr. Brennan to discuss the regulatory implications, that's when everything changed. Michael continued. "Within a week, I was accused of sharing confidential project information with the Oregon Environmental Council. They had email logs showing that I'd accessed specific project files and phone records showing calls to the Environmental Council's offices." Claire frowned. "Had you contacted the Environmental Council?" "Not about specific projects, but I had called them to ask general questions about wetland regulations, trying to educate myself so I could do my job properly. Those legitimate research calls were reframed as evidence that I was leaking confidential information to activist groups." Michael had been terminated within days of raising his regulatory concerns with Dr. Brennan. Like Claire and Jennifer, he'd been escorted out of the building by security, his access to files cut off immediately, his professional reputation destroyed by accusations he couldn't effectively refute. "The thing that kept me awake at night," Michael said, "wasn't just losing my job. It was knowing that those wetlands were going to be destroyed because I hadn't been able to stop it. Entire ecosystems, decades or centuries in the making, bulldozed for strip malls and parking lots." By the time we returned to Claire's apartment that evening, the scope of Cascade Solutions' systematic corruption was becoming clear. This wasn't just about one fraudulent project or a few bad actors. This was an institutionalized system for neutralizing environmental protection, disguised as legitimate consulting work. Helen had been taking notes throughout our meetings, and now she spread them out on Claire's coffee table alongside the documents we'd been reviewing for days. "There's definitely a pattern here," she said. "But what I don't understand is how they're getting away with it. Environmental regulations exist for a reason. There should be oversight, accountability, consequences for falsifying assessments." Claire sat down heavily on her couch, exhaustion and anger warring in her expression. "That's what I used to think too. But I'm starting to realize that the system only works if the people within it act with integrity. If consulting firms like Cascade Solutions are willing to lie, and if developers are willing to pay them to lie, and if regulatory agencies don't have the resources to double-check every assessment, then the whole system breaks down." I thought about the students I'd worked with over the years, bright young people like Claire, who'd entered their careers believing that hard work and honesty would be rewarded, that systems existed to protect important values like education and environmental stewardship. It was heartbreaking to watch my daughter learn that sometimes the system itself was the problem. "So what do we do?" I asked. "We have evidence of a pattern, but how do we get anyone in authority to pay attention?" Claire was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photographs of the Riverside development site that we'd taken during our visit. Finally, she looked up with an expression that reminded me of her mother when Helen had decided to go back to school in her 40s, despite everyone telling her it was impractical. "We're going to expose them," Claire said simply. "All of them. Not just Tyler Brooks and Dr. Brennan, but the whole system. We're going to document everything, gather every piece of evidence, contact every person who's been hurt by this scheme, and then we're going to make it impossible for them to continue operating." Helen and I exchanged glances. We'd raised Claire to stand up for what was right, but this felt like taking on a system much larger and more powerful than our family. Still, looking at the evidence spread out around us, at the documentation of systematic environmental destruction disguised as legitimate business, I knew she was right. "Where do we start?" Helen asked. Claire pulled out her laptop and opened a new document. "We start by building an airtight case. We document every person who's been pushed out, every project that's been compromised, every instance where environmental protections have been circumvented for profit. We gather so much evidence that no one can dismiss it as the complaints of a few disgruntled former employees." She paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "And then we find someone with the authority and the integrity to do something about it." The next morning, Claire called David Chen, the fourth environmental scientist who'd been terminated from Cascade Solutions. David was harder to reach than Jennifer and Michael, initially reluctant to talk about his experience. But when Claire explained what we were doing, his attitude shifted. "I've been waiting for someone to ask the right questions," David said when we met him for lunch at a restaurant in the Pearl District. He was older than the other terminated employees, in his mid-30s, with the confident bearing of someone who'd worked in environmental consulting for over a decade before joining Cascade Solutions. "I knew something was wrong from my first month there," David continued, pulling out a thick folder from his briefcase. "I'd worked for 3 other consulting firms, and I'd never seen such pressure to minimize environmental concerns. At every other company, our job was to identify potential problems and recommend mitigation strategies. At Cascade Solutions, the expectation was to find ways to classify problems as non-problems." David's termination had been particularly cruel because it targeted his personal integrity in a way that was harder to disprove than the accusations against the others. He'd been accused of padding his expense reports, claiming reimbursement for meals and travel that supposedly never occurred. The evidence against him was meticulous. Restaurant receipts that didn't match his claimed locations, hotel charges for nights when he was allegedly working from home, mileage claims for site visits that GPS data suggested he'd never made. "The thing was, all of those expenses were legitimate," David said, spreading out copies of his expense reports alongside supporting documentation. "I kept every receipt, documented every trip, photographed every site visit. But somehow, Cascade Solutions had records showing I'd claimed expenses for work I hadn't done." Claire leaned forward, studying the documents. "How is that possible?" "I think they were tracking my movements more closely than I realized. Not just my work computer and company phone, but possibly my personal devices too. They would have known when I was actually at a site versus when I claimed to be there." If there were any discrepancies, even innocent ones like arriving a few hours later than planned or leaving earlier due to weather, they could frame those as evidence of falsified expense reports. David had been with Cascade Solutions for only 4 months, but in that time he'd worked on 6 different projects and identified serious environmental concerns with 4 of them. Like the others, he'd found his projects reassigned and his concerns dismissed before being terminated for fabricated ethical violations. "What made me angriest," David said, "was realizing that they'd hired me specifically because of my experience and reputation. They wanted someone with credible environmental credentials to sign off on questionable assessments. When I refused to compromise my professional standards, I became a liability instead of an asset." We spent the afternoon with David, documenting his experience and reviewing the evidence he'd preserved. By the time we parted ways, we had detailed accounts from 4 different environmental scientists, all following the same pattern of recruitment, exploitation, and elimination. That evening, back at Claire's apartment, we organized everything we'd gathered into a comprehensive timeline. The picture that emerged was even more disturbing than we'd initially realized. Cascade Solutions had been systematically cycling through environmental consultants, hiring idealistic young scientists, using them to legitimize questionable assessments for as long as possible, then discarding them when they became obstacles to profit. The environmental cost was staggering. In the past 2 years alone, projects approved based on Cascade Solutions assessments had resulted in the destruction of hundreds of acres of wetlands, old-growth forest, and critical wildlife habitat. Entire ecosystems had been sacrificed for shopping centers and luxury housing developments that primarily benefited wealthy developers and investors. "This isn't just about our careers," Claire said, staring at photographs of the environmental damage we'd documented during our research. "This is about the legacy we're leaving for future generations. Every wetland they've allowed to be destroyed, every forest they've classified as non-essential, every species habitat they've dismissed as expendable, that's gone forever." Helen had been researching regulatory agencies and oversight bodies that might have jurisdiction over environmental consulting firms. "I think we need to contact the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality," she said. "They have authority to investigate fraudulent environmental assessments and can recommend criminal charges if they find evidence of intentional deception." Claire nodded, but her expression was troubled. "The question is whether they'll take this seriously coming from a group of terminated employees, or whether they'll dismiss it as sour grapes from people who couldn't cut it in private consulting." I thought about my experience dealing with school district politics, situations where doing the right thing meant challenging powerful people who had a lot to lose if the truth came out. "We need an ally," I said. "Someone with credibility and authority who can help us get this information to the right people." Claire was quiet for a moment, then suddenly sat up straighter. "Professor Angela Martinez," she said. "She was my graduate advisor at Oregon State, and she's one of the most respected environmental policy experts in the Pacific Northwest. If anyone would understand the implications of what we've discovered, it would be her." The next morning, Claire called Professor Martinez and explained our situation. Within an hour, we were driving to Corvallis to meet with her at the Oregon State University campus. Professor Martinez was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and the intense focus of someone who'd spent decades studying the intersection of environmental science and public policy. "What you're describing is more serious than you probably realize," Professor Martinez said after reviewing our evidence. We were sitting in her office, surrounded by books about environmental law and policy, charts showing climate change data, and photographs from her field research around the world. "Environmental consulting firms hold a position of enormous public trust," she continued. "When they certify that a development project won't cause significant environmental damage, regulatory agencies and the public rely on that assessment to make decisions that affect entire communities for generations. If that trust is violated systematically, the consequences go far beyond individual careers." Professor Martinez had spent years studying regulatory capture, the process by which industries gain influence over the agencies meant to regulate them. What Claire had uncovered at Cascade Solutions was a textbook example of how corporate interests could undermine environmental protection through seemingly legitimate channels. The genius of this scheme, Professor Martinez explained, is that it operates within the legal framework while completely subverting its intent. Cascade Solutions isn't breaking environmental laws directly. They're manipulating the assessment process that determines whether those laws apply to specific projects. She pulled out a map of Oregon showing recent development projects, many of which had been approved based on environmental assessments from Cascade Solutions. The pattern was striking. Projects that should have triggered extensive environmental review had been classified as having minimal impact, allowing them to proceed with minimal oversight. This represents a systematic failure of environmental protection, Professor Martinez said grimly. Not just in Oregon, but potentially in other states where similar consulting firms are operating with similar methods. Claire looked overwhelmed by the scope of what we'd uncovered. So what do we do? How do we stop something this big? Professor Martinez leaned back in her chair, considering the question. You need to approach this strategically. The evidence you've gathered is compelling, but you'll need to present it in a way that forces action from multiple agencies simultaneously. If you only contact one regulatory body, they might be able to contain or delay the investigation. But if you coordinate disclosure to several agencies at once, along with media coverage, it becomes much harder to suppress. She helped us identify the key agencies and organizations that should be contacted: the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's regional office, the Oregon State Attorney General's office, and several environmental organizations with the resources to pursue legal action. You'll also need to protect yourselves, Professor Martinez warned. If Cascade Solutions realizes that former employees are coordinating to expose their practices, they may try to discredit you preemptively or take legal action to prevent disclosure. As we drove back to Portland that evening, loaded down with contacts and strategy recommendations from Professor Martinez, Claire was quieter than she'd been in days. Finally, she broke the silence. I keep thinking about all the places that are already gone, she said. All the wetlands and forests that were destroyed while I was still working there, still believing that the system worked the way it was supposed to work. I could have spoken up sooner. I could have done something before so much damage was done. Helen reached back from the passenger seat to squeeze Claire's hand. Sweetheart, you couldn't have known. And even if you had known, there's no guarantee that speaking up sooner would have changed anything. They were specifically targeting people like you, people who cared enough to notice problems and honest enough to report them. I looked at Claire in the rearview mirror, seeing the weight of responsibility and guilt that she was carrying. The most important thing now is what we do going forward, I said. We can't change what's already been destroyed, but we can prevent future destruction. And we can make sure that other young professionals don't get thrown away like you were. Claire nodded, but I could see that she was struggling with the magnitude of what lay ahead. Taking on Cascade Solutions meant challenging not just a corrupt consulting firm, but an entire system that prioritized profit over environmental protection. It meant risking further damage to her professional reputation, potential legal retaliation, and the possibility that even with overwhelming evidence, the system might protect itself rather than reform. But as we pulled into the parking lot of her apartment building, Claire straightened her shoulders and looked at Helen and me with determination that reminded me of the little girl who used to organize neighborhood recycling drives and write letters to the mayor about protecting local parks. Tomorrow we start making the calls, she said simply. It's time to let everyone know what Cascade Solutions has really been doing. The Oregon Department of Environmental Quality offices in downtown Portland felt imposing in a way that made my stomach churn as we walked through the glass doors. Claire had spent the past week preparing for this moment, organizing evidence into neat folders, rehearsing her presentation, coordinating with Jennifer, Michael, and David to ensure their stories aligned with the timeline we'd constructed. But standing in the sterile lobby, watching government employees hurry past with briefcases and serious expressions, the magnitude of what we were attempting felt overwhelming. Rachel Kim, the DEQ investigator who'd agreed to meet with us, turned out to be a woman in her 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen enough bureaucratic nonsense to have little patience for it. She led us to a small conference room where Claire spread out 2 years' worth of documentation across the table like pieces of a vast, damning puzzle. Before we begin, Rachel said, pulling out a digital recorder. I need to be clear about something. What you're alleging is serious enough to trigger a formal investigation if substantiated. But I've seen plenty of cases where disgruntled former employees make accusations that sound compelling but don't hold up under scrutiny. I need you to walk me through this methodically, with specific evidence for every claim. Claire nodded, her hands steady as she opened the first folder. We'll start with the Riverside Development Project, because that's where I first noticed the pattern. But what we've discovered goes much deeper than one fraudulent assessment. For the next 3 hours, Claire walked Rachel through the evidence we'd gathered. She showed her the original environmental data that indicated serious contamination and endangered species habitats at the Riverside site, then the sanitized final report that had somehow transformed those red flags into green lights for development. She presented documentation of her attempts to raise concerns through proper channels, followed by the systematic isolation and eventual termination that resulted from those efforts. Rachel's expression grew increasingly grim as Claire moved through the files documenting Jennifer, Michael, and David's experiences. When Claire played the audio recordings she'd made of meetings where Tyler Brooks had explicitly instructed her to minimize environmental concerns to expedite project approvals, Rachel stopped the playback and asked to hear certain sections again. How many projects would you estimate have been affected by these practices? Rachel asked, making notes in a legal pad that was already half full. Helen had created a spreadsheet tracking every development project that had received environmental approval from Cascade Solutions over the past 2 years. At least 47 projects that we've identified, Helen said, sliding the printed pages across the table, representing over 3,000 acres of wetlands, forests, and sensitive habitat areas. Rachel studied the spreadsheet, occasionally cross-referencing it with her own files. Some of these projects are already under construction, she said quietly. If your allegations are accurate, we're looking at violations that have already caused irreversible environmental damage. The meeting stretched into the afternoon, as Rachel requested additional documentation, asked for clarification on technical details, and probed for any inconsistencies in our account. But rather than feeling defensive, Claire seemed to gain confidence with each question, her expertise and passion for environmental protection evident in every answer. There's something else, Claire said as Rachel began organizing the evidence we'd provided. Dr. Brennan, the man who fired me, is financially invested in Northern Vista Holdings, the company developing the Riverside site. We have documentation showing his ownership stake in the parent company. Rachel's pen stopped moving. You're alleging that the head of Cascade Solutions has a direct financial interest in projects his firm is supposed to be objectively assessing? Claire nodded, pulling out the corporate filings Helen had uncovered during her research. It gets worse. We found connections between Cascade Solutions and at least 6 other development companies. Not just consulting contracts, but actual ownership interests, shared board members, interlinked financial structures. What we'd discovered was that Cascade Solutions wasn't just a consulting firm that had been corrupted by client pressure. It was essentially a subsidiary of the development industry, designed from the ground up to rubber stamp environmental approvals for projects that enriched its owners and partners. Rachel gathered our evidence into boxes, promising to begin a formal investigation within the week. But as we left the DEQ offices, Claire seemed deflated rather than energized. What if they bury it? She asked as we walked back to the parking garage. What if Dr. Brennan has enough political connections to make this disappear before it goes anywhere? Helen squeezed Claire's arm. That's why we're not stopping here. Professor Martinez was right about needing multiple pressure points. Our next stop was the offices of the Oregonian, where investigative reporter James Morrison had agreed to meet with us based on Professor Martinez's recommendation. Morrison was younger than I'd expected, probably not much older than Claire, but his questions were sharp, and his understanding of environmental policy surprisingly sophisticated. Corporate environmental fraud is notoriously difficult to prosecute, Morrison explained as he reviewed our documentation. The science is complex, the regulations are technical, and most judges and juries don't have the background to understand the nuances. But what you've documented here is different. This isn't just about interpreting data differently. This is about systematically falsifying assessments for financial gain. Morrison was particularly interested in the audio recordings Claire had made, especially the ones where Tyler Brooks had explicitly instructed her to ignore environmental regulations that might delay project approvals. These are going to be powerful, he said, listening to one recording where Tyler had told Claire that, quote, environmental consulting is about finding solutions for clients, not creating problems. How long before you can publish? Claire asked. I'll need at least 2 weeks to verify your claims independently and get responses from Cascade Solutions and the affected development companies. But assuming everything checks out, this will be front-page material. The environmental angle is compelling, but the financial corruption angle makes it a business scandal that will get attention beyond just environmental circles. Morrison also suggested we contact the Oregon State Attorney General's office, since the financial relationships between Cascade Solutions and development companies might constitute wire fraud or other criminal violations. If this is as systematic as you're suggesting, we're not just talking about regulatory violations, we're talking about a criminal conspiracy to defraud the public. The Attorney General's office was housed in an imposing government building that made the DEQ offices look welcoming by comparison. The prosecutor who met with us, Linda Foster, had the kind of intense focus that suggested she'd built her career on taking down white-collar criminals who thought they were too smart to get caught. Environmental fraud cases are challenging, Linda admitted after reviewing our evidence. But they're also personally satisfying when you can prove them. These people are literally selling out future generations for short-term profit. Linda was particularly interested in the financial connections between Dr. Brennan and the development companies, since that created clear conflicts of interest that could be prosecuted as fraud even without getting into the technical environmental details. What I need from you, Linda said, is patience. Building a criminal case takes time, especially when we're dealing with sophisticated defendants who have good lawyers. But if your evidence holds up under investigation, I can promise you that we'll pursue this aggressively. The following week passed in a blur of phone calls, meetings, and document reviews as various agencies began their investigations. Rachel Kim called daily with updates on the DEQ's progress, often requesting additional information or clarification on technical details. James Morrison contacted us several times as he worked to independently verify our claims, tracking down former Cascade Solutions employees and requesting responses from the companies we'd accused. But it was the call from Marcus Thompson that changed everything. Claire's phone rang on a Thursday evening while we were having dinner at her apartment, reviewing the latest batch of documents the DEQ had requested. When she saw Marcus's name on the caller ID, she hesitated before answering. Claire? Marcus's voice was strained, urgent. I heard you've been talking to reporters and investigators about Cascade Solutions. Marcus, I tried to come to you with my concerns when I was still working there. You shut me down. I know, and I'm calling to apologize and to help if it's not too late. There was a long pause. Claire, I've been keeping records too. Everything. 2 years worth of documentation about projects I knew were fraudulent, assessments I was pressured to approve, environmental damage I was forced to ignore. Claire's eyes widened as she looked at Helen and me. Why didn't you say anything before? Because I was scared. I have a family, a mortgage, kids in college. I couldn't afford to lose my job, especially not after watching what happened to you and the others. Marcus's voice cracked slightly. But I can't keep quiet anymore. What they're doing is destroying ecosystems that took thousands of years to develop. I became an environmental scientist to protect places like the ones we're allowing to be destroyed. Marcus agreed to meet with us the next day, bringing with him evidence that dwarfed what we'd already gathered. As a senior scientist who'd been with Cascade Solutions for over 5 years, he'd been involved in dozens of problematic assessments, had access to internal communications we'd never seen, and most importantly, had recorded conversations with Dr. Brennan, where the financial motivations behind fraudulent assessments were discussed explicitly. Brennan doesn't just have ownership interests in development companies, Marcus explained as we reviewed his files in Claire's living room. He's been using Cascade Solutions as essentially a money laundering operation, funneling profits from fraudulent environmental assessments back into development projects he's invested in. The consulting fees are just the surface level. The real money comes from the increased property values when previously undevelopable land gets environmental approval. Marcus had documentation showing that Dr. Brennan had made over $2 million in profit over the past 3 years from development projects that had received questionable environmental approvals from his own firm. It wasn't just a conflict of interest. It was a criminal enterprise disguised as environmental consulting. There's something else, Marcus said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "They know you're investigating." Tyler Brooks has been asking questions about former employees, trying to figure out who might be talking to authorities. They're preparing to discredit anyone who comes forward. Claire's face went pale. "What do you mean, discredit?" "They're building files on everyone who was terminated, looking for personal information that could be used to undermine credibility if you testify in any legal proceedings. Financial problems, relationship issues, anything that could make you look unreliable or vindictive." I felt a surge of protective anger that reminded me of the times I dealt with bullying situations at school. Administrators who thought they could intimidate students and families into silence. "Let them try," I said. "We have documentation of everything we've alleged. Personal attacks won't change the evidence." But Marcus shook his head. "You don't understand. They have resources, connections, expensive lawyers. They can make your lives very difficult even if they can't disprove your allegations." Helen had been quiet during most of our conversation with Marcus, but now she leaned forward with the determined expression that meant she was about to say something important. "Then we need to make sure our evidence gets out before they have a chance to suppress it." The next morning, Claire called James Morrison and told him we were ready to accelerate the timeline for publication. "We have new evidence and a new witness, but we also have reason to believe that Cascade Solutions is preparing to retaliate against us. We need this story published as soon as possible." Morrison had been planning to take another week for verification, but when Claire described Marcus's evidence and the potential for retaliation, he agreed to expedite his timeline. "I can have the story ready by Friday if you can get me access to your new witness and his documentation today." We spent the day with Morrison and Marcus, reviewing files, verifying claims, and preparing Marcus for the intense scrutiny that would follow publication. Morrison was particularly excited about the recordings Marcus had made of his conversations with Dr. Brennan, since they provided direct evidence of criminal intent rather than just questionable business practices. "These recordings are going to be devastating," Morrison said as he listened to one where Dr. Brennan had explicitly told Marcus to, quote, "find a way to make the environmental problems disappear," for a wetlands project that would generate millions in development profits. Thursday evening, Morrison called to tell us the story would run on Friday's front page, with the headline, "Environmental Consulting Firm Accused of Systematic Fraud." But he also warned us that Cascade Solutions had already retained a high-powered public relations firm and was preparing an aggressive response. "They're going to attack your credibility, claim you're disgruntled former employees seeking revenge, and try to frame this as a dispute over scientific methodology rather than criminal fraud," Morrison said. "Be prepared for them to get very personal very quickly." Claire spent Thursday night unable to sleep, alternating between excitement about finally exposing Cascade Solutions, corruption, and anxiety about the potential consequences. Helen and I had decided to stay in Portland through the weekend, knowing that Claire would need support as the story broke and the inevitable retaliation began. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical Pacific Northwest weather that somehow felt appropriate for the day we were about to confront a system designed to prioritize profit over environmental protection. Morrison's story was indeed front-page news, with a headline that was even more direct than he'd promised. "Local environmental firm accused of criminal fraud in multi-million-dollar scheme." The story was devastating in its comprehensiveness, laying out not just the specific allegations against Cascade Solutions, but the broader implications for environmental protection in Oregon and potentially other states. Morrison had done excellent work independently verifying our claims, tracking down additional former employees who confirmed the pattern of corruption, and getting responses from regulatory agencies that suggested serious investigations were already underway. But it was the sidebar story about Dr. Brennan's financial interests that proved most damaging to Cascade Solutions' reputation. Morrison had uncovered evidence that Brennan's investments in development companies totaled over $15 million, making him one of the largest private beneficiaries of Oregon's recent development boom, much of which had been enabled by environmental approvals from his own consulting firm. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Claire's phone started ringing before 7 a.m., with calls from reporters, investigators, other environmental scientists who'd had similar experiences with different consulting firms. and environmental organizations offering support and legal assistance. But the response from Cascade Solutions was also swift and vicious. By 9 a.m., their public relations firm had released a statement describing Claire, Jennifer, Michael, David, and Marcus as disgruntled former employees with documented performance issues who were attempting to damage the reputation of a respected environmental consulting firm through false and defamatory allegations. The statement went on to describe Claire specifically as someone who had been terminated for serious ethical violations and whose pattern of inflammatory accusations suggested personal rather than professional motivations for coming forward. It was exactly the kind of character assassination that Marcus had warned us about, designed to shift focus from the evidence we'd presented to our personal credibility. "How are you holding up?" Helen asked Claire as we sat in her living room watching news coverage of the story on her laptop. Claire was staring at the screen, watching a segment where a Cascade Solutions spokesperson was describing her as an employee who, quote, struggled with the practical realities of environmental consulting and had been, quote, counseled repeatedly about unrealistic expectations and unprofessional behavior. "It's strange," Claire said, finally. "I thought this would feel more satisfying, seeing the truth finally published, watching people respond with outrage about what they've been doing. But mostly I just feel tired." I understood what she meant. We'd spent months building toward this moment, gathering evidence, coordinating with investigators, preparing for the inevitable retaliation. But actually experiencing it, watching Cascade Solutions attempt to destroy her reputation in real time, was exhausting in a way that the preparation hadn't fully captured. The afternoon brought news that the Oregon State Attorney General's office was opening a formal criminal investigation into Cascade Solutions' business practices, and that the DEQ was suspending the firm's certification to conduct environmental assessments pending the outcome of their investigation. But it also brought increasingly personal attacks from Cascade Solutions' allies, including a statement from the Oregon Association of Environmental Consultants, questioning whether unsubstantiated allegations from terminated employees should be given credibility without more thorough investigation. "They're trying to make this about us instead of about the evidence," Helen observed as we watched the news coverage expand throughout the day. Claire nodded, but her expression was determined rather than defeated. "Which means we need to keep the focus on what they actually did, not on who we are or why we're coming forward." That evening, Claire received a call from Professor Martinez, who'd been watching the news coverage from her office at Oregon State. "I wanted you to know that several of my colleagues in environmental science are preparing a joint statement supporting your allegations and calling for a comprehensive investigation of environmental consulting practices statewide," Professor Martinez said. "What you've exposed isn't just about one corrupt firm. It's about systematic failures in environmental protection that could be happening anywhere." The joint statement from Oregon's environmental science community, released on Saturday morning, provided the credibility boost that Claire needed to counter Cascade Solutions' character attacks. Signed by over 30 professors and researchers from universities across the state, it described the evidence against Cascade Solutions as compelling and consistent with patterns of regulatory capture that have undermined environmental protection in other contexts. More importantly, the statement called for investigations into other environmental consulting firms, suggesting that Cascade Solutions might not be an isolated case of corruption, but part of a broader problem with how environmental assessments were conducted and regulated. Sunday brought the news that would change everything. James Morrison called early in the morning with information he'd received from a source within the Oregon State Attorney General's office. "They've found evidence that Cascade Solutions' practices extend beyond Oregon," Morrison said, his voice tight with excitement. "Similar patterns of fraudulent assessments in Washington, California, and Idaho, all connected to the same network of development companies and investment groups that Dr. Brennan is involved with." Claire sat down heavily on her couch as Morrison explained that what we'd uncovered in Oregon appeared to be part of a multi-state environmental fraud scheme worth tens of millions of dollars. Federal agencies were now getting involved, and the investigation was expanding to include possible violations of interstate commerce laws, wire fraud statutes, and federal environmental regulations. "This is going to be much bigger than we realized," Morrison said. "You may have exposed one of the largest environmental fraud schemes in the Pacific Northwest's history." Helen and I exchanged glances as Claire processed this information. What had started as our daughter trying to clear her name and prevent future environmental damage had evolved into exposing a criminal enterprise that had been operating across multiple states for years. "What happens now?" Claire asked. Morrison was quiet for a moment before answering. "Now it gets complicated. Federal investigations take time, sometimes years. Cascade Solutions and their allies are going to fight back hard, probably with lawsuits designed to silence you and drain your resources. And you're going to be at the center of a very public, very contentious legal battle." After Morrison hung up, the three of us sat in Claire's living room, contemplating the magnitude of what lay ahead. Claire had wanted to fight back against the people who destroyed her career and were destroying Oregon's environment. Now she was facing the prospect of being a key witness in federal criminal prosecutions that could take years to resolve. "Are you ready for this?" I asked her. Claire was quiet for a long time, staring out her window at the Willamette River flowing past her apartment building. Finally, she turned to Helen and me with an expression that reminded me of the determined little girl who used to organize cleanup days at the local park. "I keep thinking about all the places that are already gone because of what they did," she said. "All the wetlands and forests that got destroyed, while I was still believing the system worked the way it was supposed to. I can't bring those places back, but maybe I can prevent them from destroying more." She paused, then looked directly at me. "Dad, when you were dealing with difficult situations at school, did you ever want to just give up because the system seemed too big and too corrupt to change?" I thought about the times I'd faced administrators who cared more about avoiding controversy than protecting students, school board members who prioritized political considerations over educational needs, systemic problems that seemed too entrenched to solve. "Many times," I said honestly. "But I learned that you don't have to change the entire system all at once. You just have to do the right thing in your small piece of it, and hope that other people will do the same in their pieces." Claire nodded slowly. "Then that's what we're going to do. We're going to see this through, no matter how long it takes or how hard they try to stop us." Monday morning brought confirmation that the FBI had opened an investigation into interstate environmental fraud, with Cascade Solutions as the primary target. Claire received a call requesting her cooperation as a federal witness, which would provide her with certain legal protections but also meant her life would be under scrutiny for the duration of the investigation. "It's going to be hard," Helen said as we prepared to drive back to Cedar Heights, leaving Claire to face whatever came next. "They're going to try to break you down, make you question whether it was worth it." Claire hugged us both tightly before we left. "I know. But for the first time since that midnight phone call, I feel like I'm doing something that matters. Something that my grandmother would have been proud of." As Helen and I drove away from Portland that afternoon, I watched the city disappear in the rearview mirror and thought about the strange journey that had brought us to this point. It had started with a desperate phone call from a daughter whose career had been destroyed by people who'd exploited her integrity. Now it was evolving into something much larger, a fight not just for Claire's vindication, but for the protection of environments and communities across multiple states. I didn't know how it would end, but I knew that Claire was no longer the broken young woman who'd called us crying in the middle of the night. She'd found her purpose in exposing corruption and protecting the places she'd devoted her career to studying. And sometimes, that's all you can ask for. The opportunity to turn your worst experience into something meaningful for others. The federal courthouse in Portland felt like a cathedral of justice, as Claire walked up the granite steps on a crisp October morning, 6 months after the FBI investigation had begun in earnest. The media attention had been relentless throughout the summer, with reporters camped outside her apartment building and camera crews following her to the grocery store. But today felt different. Today was the day Dr. Richard Brennan and Tyler Brooks would finally face the consequences of their systematic destruction of environmental protections. Claire wore the same navy blue suit she'd worn to her job interview at Cascade Solutions almost 2 years earlier, a choice that felt both symbolic and defiant. Helen walked beside her, carrying a briefcase filled with the original documentation that had started this entire journey. I followed a step behind, marveling at how composed Claire appeared despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. The courtroom was packed with reporters, environmental activists, other former Cascade Solutions employees, and representatives from the development companies that had been implicated in the expanding investigation. As we took our seats in the gallery, I spotted Marcus Thompson near the front, looking nervous but determined. He'd become the star witness for the prosecution, after agreeing to cooperate fully in exchange for immunity from criminal charges. Federal prosecutor Sarah Chen stood to deliver her opening statement, and the silence in the courtroom was absolute. Chen was a woman in her early 40s with the kind of quiet intensity that suggested she'd built her career on cases exactly like this one. Complex white-collar prosecutions that required both legal expertise and moral conviction. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Chen began, this case is about the systematic corruption of environmental protection for personal profit. Over the course of 4 years, the defendants orchestrated a scheme that resulted in the destruction of over 8,000 acres of protected wetlands, old-growth forests, and critical wildlife habitats across 4 states. The numbers were staggering. What had started as Claire's concerns about one fraudulent project had mushroomed into evidence of environmental fraud spanning Oregon, Washington, California, and Idaho. The FBI's investigation had uncovered a network of consulting firms, development companies, and regulatory officials who had collaborated to circumvent environmental protections on a scale that prosecutors described as unprecedented. Dr. Richard Brennan didn't just own Cascade Solutions. Chen continued, gesturing toward the defendant's table where Brennan sat in an expensive suit, his expression carefully neutral. He owned pieces of 47 different development companies that benefited from fraudulent environmental assessments his firm provided. This wasn't a case of poor judgment or regulatory interpretation. This was a criminal enterprise designed to generate profit by destroying irreplaceable natural resources. The prosecution's case unfolded over 3 weeks, with witness after witness describing how Cascade Solutions had operated as a front for development interests rather than an independent consulting firm. Environmental scientists testified about being pressured to ignore contamination, falsify species surveys, and minimize the ecological significance of areas slated for development. Claire's testimony came on the 2nd week, and I'd never been more proud of her. She spoke clearly and methodically about her experience at Cascade Solutions, walking the jury through the systematic pressure she'd faced to compromise her professional standards. When the defense attorneys tried to characterize her as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge, Claire's response was devastating in its simplicity. I became an environmental scientist because I wanted to protect places that can't protect themselves, she said, looking directly at the jury. When I discovered that my employer was using my credentials to destroy those places for profit, I had 2 choices. I could stay quiet to protect my career, or I could speak up to protect the environment. I chose to speak up. The defense attorneys had clearly prepared for a character assassination approach, but Claire's calm professionalism and obvious expertise made their attacks seem petty and desperate. When they tried to suggest that her environmental concerns were unrealistic for practical consulting work, Claire responded with detailed explanations of federal regulations and industry standards that made it clear she understood her field far better than her accusers. Marcus Thompson's testimony was even more damaging to the defense. As a senior scientist who'd worked inside Cascade Solutions for 5 years, he could describe the systematic nature of the fraud from the perspective of someone who'd been complicit in it before finding the courage to come forward. Dr. Brennan made it clear from my first week that environmental assessments were sales tools, not scientific documents, Marcus testified, his voice steady despite obvious nervousness. He told me that our job was to find ways to make environmental problems disappear on paper, not to honestly assess ecological impacts. The recordings Marcus had made of his conversations with Brennan were played for the jury, and the effect was electric. Hearing Brennan's voice instructing Marcus to, quote, massage the data and find creative interpretations of environmental regulations removed any doubt about criminal intent. If we're too honest about environmental impacts, we'll price ourselves out of the market, Brennan's voice echoed through the courtroom speakers. Our clients don't hire us to create problems, they hire us to solve them. The financial evidence was equally compelling. FBI forensic accountants had traced over $23 million in profits that Brennan had generated through his ownership stakes in development projects that received environmental approval from his own consulting firm. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity. Cascade Solutions would provide fraudulent environmental assessments that allowed problematic projects to proceed, Brennan would profit from the increased property values as an investor, and the environmental costs would be borne by communities and ecosystems that had no legal representation. Tyler Brooks proved to be a less sympathetic defendant than Brennan. Where Brennan maintained an air of wounded dignity, suggesting that his actions had been within the bounds of aggressive but legitimate business practices, Brooks came across as a mid-level enforcer who'd enthusiastically participated in environmental destruction for personal advancement. The prosecution played recordings of Brooks instructing environmental scientists to ignore wetland boundaries, minimize wildlife habitat assessments, and classify contaminated areas as suitable for development. His defense team tried to argue that he'd been following orders from Brennan, but the evidence showed that Brooks had often exceeded even Brennan's explicit instructions in pushing for environmental approvals. Mr. Brooks wasn't just following orders, Prosecutor Chen argued during closing statements. He was an enthusiastic participant in environmental destruction, someone who saw ecological protection as an obstacle to be overcome, rather than a responsibility to be honored. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges against both defendants. The courtroom erupted in applause from environmental activists and former Cascade Solutions employees, while the defense attorneys immediately announced their intention to appeal. But it was the sentencing hearing 6 weeks later that provided the most satisfying resolution to Claire's ordeal. Federal Judge Patricia Williams had a reputation for taking environmental crimes seriously, and her comments from the bench left no doubt about her view of the defendants' actions. Dr. Brennan and Mr. Brooks didn't just defraud their clients or violate business ethics, Judge Williams said, looking directly at the defendants. They participated in the systematic destruction of irreplaceable natural resources that belonged to all Americans. Wetlands that took thousands of years to develop, forests that provided habitat for endangered species, ecosystems that served critical roles in flood control and water purification, all sacrificed for short-term profit. Brennan was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $47 million in restitution, representing the full amount of profits he'd generated through the fraudulent scheme. Brooks received 4 years and was ordered to pay $8 million in restitution. Both men were permanently barred from working in environmental consulting, but the criminal convictions were only part of the resolution. The civil lawsuits that followed resulted in additional hundreds of millions in damages paid to communities affected by fraudulent development projects, funding for restoration of damaged ecosystems, and establishment of a whistleblower protection fund for environmental professionals who report corruption. Claire had testified in 17 different legal proceedings over the course of 2 years, from criminal trials to civil lawsuits to regulatory hearings. The process had been exhausting and sometimes traumatic, but it had also been transformative in ways she couldn't have anticipated when she first called me crying at midnight. The restoration project at the Riverside Development Site became a symbol of what was possible when environmental protection was taken seriously. The luxury condominiums that had been planned for the wetlands were canceled, the development company was forced into bankruptcy by legal settlements, and the land was purchased by the state of Oregon for permanent protection as a wildlife preserve. Claire was there on the day they broke ground on the restoration project, watching as heavy machinery that would normally be used for construction was instead employed to remove fill that had been illegally dumped in protected wetlands. Environmental scientists from Oregon State University had designed a comprehensive restoration plan that would return the area to its original ecological function over the course of several years. It's going to take decades for this ecosystem to fully recover, Claire told the reporters who'd gathered to cover the restoration groundbreaking. But the fact that we're giving it the chance to recover, instead of destroying it permanently, makes all the legal battles worthwhile. The personal transformation in Claire was just as remarkable as the environmental restoration. The young woman who'd called me in desperation 2 years earlier had evolved into a nationally recognized expert on environmental fraud and regulatory corruption. She'd been invited to testify before Congress about needed reforms in environmental consulting, had consulted with attorneys general in 6 different states on similar investigations, and had become a sought-after speaker at environmental conferences. But it was the work she chose to do after the legal battles ended that revealed the true depth of her growth. Instead of returning to traditional environmental consulting or pursuing academic research, Claire established the Environmental Integrity Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting whistleblowers who report environmental fraud and providing legal assistance to communities fighting against corrupt development projects. The foundation's offices were housed in a converted warehouse in southeast Portland, with large windows overlooking the Willamette River and walls lined with photographs of restored ecosystems and successful environmental protection campaigns. When I visited Claire there 6 months after the sentencing, the space buzzed with the energy of young environmental professionals who'd found purpose in fighting corruption rather than just studying ecology. "We get calls every day," Claire explained as she showed me around the foundation's offices. "Environmental scientists who are being pressured to falsify assessments, community groups that suspect their local consulting firm is corrupt, regulatory officials who need help building cases against fraudulent companies." The foundation had already initiated investigations in 8 states and had provided legal support for over 30 whistleblowers facing retaliation for reporting environmental fraud. But more importantly, it had created a network of environmental professionals committed to maintaining scientific integrity, even when that commitment came with personal costs. Grace Rodriguez had joined the foundation as its deputy director after quitting Cascade Solutions during the federal investigation. She'd been working on a comprehensive database of environmental consulting firms, tracking patterns that might indicate systematic fraud similar to what they'd uncovered in Oregon. "What we realized," Grace explained as she walked me through the database system, "is that the Cascade Solutions scheme wasn't unique. There are consulting firms in dozens of states using similar tactics to circumvent environmental protection. The difference is that most of them are more careful about covering their tracks." The foundation had also developed training programs for young environmental professionals, helping them recognize and resist pressure to compromise their scientific integrity. Jennifer Walsh had become the program's lead coordinator, drawing on her experience being targeted and discredited by Cascade Solutions to help others avoid similar traps. "The most important thing we teach," Jennifer said during one of the training sessions I observed, "is that environmental protection isn't just about following regulations. It's about understanding that you have a professional and ethical obligation to speak up when you see ecological destruction being disguised as legitimate development." The foundation's work was funded through a combination of legal settlements from environmental fraud cases, grants from environmental organizations, and donations from individuals who'd been inspired by Claire's story. But Claire had insisted from the beginning that the foundation maintain its independence from any interests that might compromise its mission. "We can't be beholden to environmental groups any more than we can be beholden to development companies," Claire explained to me during one of our regular phone calls. "Our only loyalty is to scientific integrity and environmental protection." The personal cost of Claire's transformation had been significant. The 2 years of legal battles and media attention had strained her relationships and made it difficult to maintain any semblance of normal life. She'd lost friends who thought she was being unnecessarily confrontational, dealt with harassment from supporters of Cascade Solutions, and struggled with the emotional toll of reliving traumatic experiences in courtroom after courtroom. But there had also been unexpected rewards. The foundation work had introduced her to a community of environmental professionals who shared her commitment to integrity over personal advancement. She'd developed close friendships with other whistleblowers who understood the unique challenges of challenging powerful interests from within. Marcus Thompson had become particularly close to the family, someone who understood better than anyone else what Claire had risked by speaking up. He'd joined the foundation's board of directors and had become a mentor for other environmental professionals facing pressure to compromise their standards. "Claire saved my conscience," Marcus told me during one of his visits to the foundation offices. "I'd been compromising my principles for years, telling myself I was protecting my family by staying quiet about environmental fraud. But watching her find the courage to speak up made me realize I was actually endangering my children's future by allowing environmental destruction to continue." Helen had also found purpose in the foundation's work, using her skills in research and organization to help document cases and coordinate legal strategies. She'd become particularly effective at working with communities affected by environmental fraud, helping them understand their rights and options for legal recourse. "What I've learned," Helen reflected during one of our weekend visits to Portland, "is that environmental protection isn't just about science and law. It's about communities having the power to protect the places they love from people who see only profit potential. The foundation had restored something that Claire had lost during her experience at Cascade Solutions: faith in the possibility that good people working together could overcome systematic corruption. Instead of fighting alone against overwhelming odds, she was now part of a network of environmental professionals committed to the same principles that had gotten her in trouble in the first place. The work was challenging and sometimes dangerous. The foundation had received legal threats from several consulting firms, and Claire had been the target of an intimidation campaign that included vandalism of her apartment and threatening phone calls. But the community she'd built around environmental integrity provided support and protection that she'd never experienced as an isolated whistleblower. The difference now, Claire explained to me during one of my visits, is that I'm not fighting alone. When someone tries to silence me or discredit my work, there are dozens of other environmental professionals who will speak up in defense. And when we uncover new cases of environmental fraud, we have the resources and expertise to do something about it. The foundation's success had also attracted attention from federal agencies and congressional committees interested in strengthening environmental protection. Claire had testified before the House Committee on Natural Resources about needed reforms in environmental consulting regulation, and the foundation's research had informed new legislation requiring greater transparency and accountability in environmental assessments. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the communities whose environments had been protected through the foundation's work. Claire's office wall was covered with photographs and letters from people whose wetlands had been saved from development, whose forests had been protected from clear-cutting, whose water supplies had been preserved from contamination. "This is what makes it all worthwhile," Claire said, showing me a letter from a group of elementary school students in rural Washington whose school forest had been saved from logging after the foundation exposed fraudulent environmental assessments. "These kids will grow up in a world where that forest still exists because we were willing to challenge a corrupt system." On the second anniversary of her termination from Cascade Solutions, Claire invited Helen and me to join her for a hike at the Riverside site, now officially designated as the Riverside Wildlife Preserve. The restoration work was ahead of schedule, with native vegetation already re-establishing itself in areas where luxury condominiums would have been built. We walked along paths that wound through recovering wetlands, past ponds where waterbirds were nesting, through meadows thick with wildflowers that had been planted as part of the restoration effort. It was hard to imagine that this peaceful, thriving ecosystem had almost been destroyed for a shopping center and high-end housing development. "Before we begin," Rachel said, pulling out a digital recorder, "I need to be clear about something. What you're alleging is serious enough to trigger a formal investigation if substantiated. But I've seen plenty of cases where disgruntled former employees make accusations that sound compelling but don't hold up under scrutiny. I need you to walk me through this methodically, with specific evidence for every claim." Claire nodded, her hands steady as she opened the first folder. "We'll start with the Riverside Development Project, because that's where I first noticed the pattern. But what we've discovered goes much deeper than one fraudulent assessment." For the next 3 hours, Claire walked Rachel through the evidence we'd gathered. She showed her the original environmental data that indicated serious contamination and endangered species habitats at the Riverside site, then the sanitized final report that had somehow transformed those red flags into green lights for development. She presented documentation of her attempts to raise concerns through proper channels, followed by the systematic isolation and eventual termination that resulted from those efforts. Rachel's expression grew increasingly grim as Claire moved through the files documenting Jennifer, Michael, and David's experiences. When Claire played the audio recording she'd made of meetings where Tyler Brooks had explicitly instructed her to minimize environmental concerns to expedite project approvals, Rachel stopped the playback and asked to hear certain sections again. "How many projects would you estimate have been affected by these practices?" Rachel asked, making notes in a legal pad that was already half full. Helen had created a spreadsheet tracking every development project that had received environmental approval from Cascade Solutions over the past 2 years. "At least 47 projects that we've identified," Helen said, sliding the printed pages across the table, "representing over 3,000 acres of wetlands, forests, and sensitive habitat areas." Rachel studied the spreadsheet, occasionally cross-referencing it with her own files. "Some of these projects are already under construction," she said quietly. If your allegations are accurate, we're looking at violations that have already caused irreversible environmental damage. The meeting stretched into the afternoon as Rachel requested additional documentation, asked for clarification on technical details, and probed for any inconsistencies in our account. But rather than feeling defensive, Claire seemed to gain confidence with each question, her expertise and passion for environmental protection evident in every answer. "There's something else," Claire said as Rachel began organizing the evidence we'd provided. "Dr. Brennan, the man who fired me, is financially invested in Northern Vista Holdings, the company developing the Riverside site. We have documentation showing his ownership stake in the parent company." Rachel's pen stopped moving. "You're alleging that the head of Cascade Solutions has a direct financial interest in projects his firm is supposed to be objectively assessing?" Claire nodded, pulling out the corporate filings Helen had uncovered during her research. "It gets worse. We found connections between Cascade Solutions and at least 6 other development companies. Not just consulting contracts, but actual ownership interests, shared board members, interlinked financial structures." What we'd discovered was that Cascade Solutions wasn't just a consulting firm that had been corrupted by client pressure. It was essentially a subsidiary of the development industry, designed from the ground up to rubber stamp environmental approvals for projects that enriched its owners and partners. Rachel gathered our evidence into boxes, promising to begin a formal investigation within the week. But as we left the DEQ offices, Claire seemed deflated rather than energized. "What if they bury it?" she asked as we walked back to the parking garage. "What if Dr. Brennan has enough political connections to make this disappear before it goes anywhere?" Helen squeezed Claire's arm. "That's why we're not stopping here." Professor Martinez was right about needing multiple pressure points. Our next stop was the offices of the Oregonian, where investigative reporter James Morrison had agreed to meet with us based on Professor Martinez's recommendation. Morrison was younger than I'd expected, probably not much older than Claire, but his questions were sharp, and his understanding of environmental policy surprisingly sophisticated. But what we discovered was that the problem was too big for any one organization, too systematic for isolated responses. Over the past 5 years, the Foundation had documented environmental fraud cases in 37 states, supported over 200 whistleblowers facing retaliation, and helped secure criminal convictions against 43 consulting firms engaged in systematic deception. But more importantly, it had catalyzed a fundamental shift in how environmental professionals understood their responsibilities and their power. "The most important lesson we've learned," Claire said, "is that environmental protection isn't something that happens to communities from the outside. It's something that emerges when communities have the knowledge, resources, and legal support to protect the places they love from those who would destroy them for profit." The Foundation's community empowerment programs had become its most innovative and successful initiatives. Instead of just exposing fraud after ecological damage had occurred, the Foundation now worked proactively with communities to identify potential environmental threats, understand their legal rights, and develop strategies for effective advocacy. Grace Rodriguez had pioneered this approach after realizing that most environmental fraud succeeded because affected communities lacked the technical expertise to challenge questionable assessments. The Foundation now provided training programs that taught community leaders how to read environmental impact reports, identify red flags in consulting methodologies, and connect with honest environmental professionals willing to provide independent evaluations. We've learned that the best defense against environmental fraud is an informed community that knows how to ask the right questions. Grace had explained to me during one of my visits to the Foundation's expanded offices. The original warehouse space had grown into a complex of buildings, housing research staff, legal advocates, community organizers, and the technical experts who provided pro bono consulting services to communities fighting dubious development projects. The Foundation's legal clinic had become particularly effective at challenging fraudulent environmental assessments before they could be used to justify destructive projects. Jennifer Walsh now directed a team of attorneys who specialized in environmental law and had developed innovative strategies for using public records laws, regulatory appeals, and citizen lawsuits to force transparency in environmental consulting. "What we realized," Jennifer had told me, "is that most environmental fraud depends on secrecy and complexity. When you force consulting firms to explain their methodologies publicly in language that community members can understand, the fraudulent ones can't withstand scrutiny. The legal clinic had won landmark cases establishing communities, rights to independent environmental assessments, mandatory disclosure of consulting firms, financial relationships with developers, and enhanced penalties for environmental professionals who knowingly provided false information in official reports. But perhaps the most significant development had been the Foundation's success in reforming how environmental consulting was regulated at the federal level. Claire's testimony before Congress had helped inform new legislation requiring environmental consulting firms to register with federal agencies, disclose their financial relationships with clients, and submit to regular audits of their assessment methodologies. The Environmental Professional Accountability Act changed everything, Marcus Thompson had explained during a recent board meeting I'd attended. Marcus had left traditional consulting entirely and now directed the Foundation's Professional Standards Program, working with universities and professional associations to develop new ethical guidelines for environmental scientists. The federal legislation had created whistleblower protections specifically for environmental professionals, established a national database tracking consulting firms with histories of regulatory violations, and required independent peer review for environmental assessments on projects exceeding certain size or significance thresholds. Before this law, environmental fraud was essentially a low-risk, high-reward crime. Marcus had continued. Consulting firms could falsify assessments for years without facing meaningful consequences. Now there are real penalties, real oversight, and real protection for environmental professionals who refuse to participate in fraud. The law had been named the Claire Hartwell Environmental Integrity Act, in recognition of her role in exposing the systematic nature of environmental fraud and building the coalition that made reform possible. But when I'd asked Claire about having legislation named after her, she'd been characteristically modest about the recognition. "The law isn't about me," she'd said. "It's about making sure that other young environmental professionals don't have to choose between their careers and their consciences the way I did. It's about ensuring that communities can trust environmental assessments to be honest evaluations rather than marketing documents." The personal cost of Claire's transformation had been significant, but not overwhelming. The years of legal battles, media attention, and constant travel had made traditional relationships difficult, but they had also introduced her to a community of like-minded professionals who understood the unique challenges of fighting systematic corruption from within. She'd found unexpected love with Dr. James Rivera, an environmental lawyer who joined the Foundation after helping communities in California fight fraudulent mining assessments. Their relationship had developed slowly, built on shared commitment to environmental protection rather than conventional romantic circumstances. "James understands why I have to take phone calls at midnight from environmental scientists facing retaliation," Claire had explained to Helen and me when she'd first introduced him. "He doesn't see the Foundation's work as competition for my attention, because he's part of the work too." Their wedding the previous spring had been held at the Riverside Wildlife Preserve, surrounded by the restored wetlands that had started Claire's journey into environmental advocacy. The ceremony was small and simple, but it felt profound in ways that had nothing to do with traditional wedding elements and everything to do with two people choosing to build a life around shared principles. Helen had cried during Claire's vows, not from conventional mother-of-the-bride emotion, but from recognition of how far Claire had traveled from the broken young woman who'd called us that desperate night 5 years earlier. "I promise to support your work protecting the places that can't protect themselves," Claire had said to James as they stood beside the wetland where great blue herons nested in trees that would have been bulldozed if Cascade Solutions' fraud had succeeded. "And I promise to remember that love, like environmental protection, is something you have to choose actively every day, not just something you declare once and assume will continue automatically." The Foundation's work had also brought unexpected reconciliation with parts of Claire's professional past. Dr. Patricia Williams, the environmental science professor who'd helped us understand the scope of Cascade Solutions' fraud, had become not just an ally, but a close friend and mentor. She now served on the Foundation's board and had integrated the Foundation's case studies into her curriculum at Oregon State. "What Claire has accomplished," Dr. Williams had told me during one of the Foundation's annual fundraising dinners, "is demonstrate that environmental science can be a force for justice, not just academic knowledge. Her students see that their future careers can be about fighting for environmental protection, not just documenting environmental destruction. Even some of Claire's former colleagues from Cascade Solutions had eventually reached out, seeking forgiveness and ways to contribute to the Foundation's work. The environmental scientists who'd stayed silent during her ordeal had watched the subsequent investigations with growing shame, realizing they'd abandoned a colleague who'd been trying to protect the very environments they'd entered the profession to serve. "I don't blame them," Claire had told me when several former Cascade Solutions employees had contacted her seeking to volunteer with the Foundation. "I understand how scary it was to speak up against systematic corruption when you had families to support and careers to protect. What matters is that they're willing to do better now." The Foundation had developed a redemption program for environmental professionals who wanted to atone for past compromises of their scientific integrity. The program provided opportunities for anonymous reporting of environmental fraud, pro bono consulting for communities fighting dubious projects, and mentoring support for younger environmental professionals facing pressure to compromise their standards. Everyone deserves a chance to get back to why they became environmental scientists in the first place, Claire had explained when announcing the redemption program. Most people entered this profession because they wanted to protect the natural world. The fact that some got lost along the way doesn't mean they can't find their way back to those original principles. But it was the Foundation's youth programs that had become Claire's most passionate focus. Working with high schools and colleges across the country, the Foundation provided opportunities for students to engage directly in environmental protection work, connecting them with communities fighting environmental threats, and giving them hands-on experience in advocacy and scientific investigation. "We can't wait until young people graduate and enter the workforce to teach them about environmental integrity," Claire had argued when proposing the youth programs. "We need to reach them while they're still forming their understanding of what environmental science can be, while they still believe it's possible to change systems that seem fixed and unchangeable." The youth programs had produced remarkable results, with high school students identifying environmental fraud in their own communities, college students choosing research projects focused on regulatory corruption, and recent graduates specifically seeking employment with organizations committed to environmental integrity rather than just environmental careers. One of the program's most successful alumni was Sarah Chen, a recent graduate from the University of Washington, who'd participated in a Foundation summer internship after her sophomore year. She now directed the Foundation's Pacific Northwest Regional Office and had been instrumental in expanding their work to include climate change fraud, cases where consulting firms minimized or ignored climate impacts of proposed development projects. Claire showed me that environmental science could be about fighting injustice, not just studying ecology. Sarah had told me during one of my visits to the regional office. "That summer internship changed my entire understanding of what my career could be." The Foundation's influence had also extended internationally, with environmental professionals from 12 countries visiting the Portland offices to study their methodologies and adapt their approaches to different regulatory and cultural contexts. Claire had been invited to speak at environmental conferences in Canada, Mexico, and several European nations, where similar problems with regulatory capture and consulting fraud were beginning to emerge. "Environmental fraud isn't uniquely American," Claire had observed after returning from a speaking tour in Scandinavia. "Anywhere there's valuable natural resources and development pressure, there are people willing to falsify environmental assessments for profit. The specific methods vary, but the basic corruption is remarkably similar across different countries and legal systems." The international work had led to the formation of the Global Environmental Integrity Alliance, a network of organizations working to expose and prevent environmental fraud on every continent. Claire served on the Alliance's coordinating council and had helped develop standardized methodologies for investigating consulting fraud that could be adapted to different legal and regulatory frameworks. But despite the Foundation's expanding influence and Claire's growing recognition as a leader in environmental reform, she'd remained grounded in the community organizing work that had been central to the Foundation's mission from the beginning. She still spent significant time visiting communities affected by environmental threats, still took phone calls from individual environmental professionals facing retaliation for honest reporting, still prioritized the local work that made national policy reforms meaningful in practice. The moment we lose touch with individual communities and individual environmental professionals, we become just another institutional voice that people learn to ignore, Claire had told the Foundation staff during a recent retreat. Our credibility comes from being connected to the real experiences of people fighting environmental destruction in their own backyards. This connection to grassroots environmental protection had been evident throughout Claire's speech at the Environmental Integrity Summit. Instead of focusing on policy achievements or organizational growth, she spent most of her time telling stories about specific communities the foundation had worked with, specific environmental professionals they'd supported, specific ecosystems they'd helped protect from fraudulent development. In rural Montana, we worked with a ranching community to expose fraudulent water quality assessments that would have allowed a mining company to contaminate the aquifer that supports both their livestock and their drinking water. Claire recounted, the consulting firm had minimized contamination risks by using outdated testing methodologies and ignoring seasonal variations in groundwater flow. The audience listened intently as Claire described how the foundation's technical experts had provided independent water quality assessments, how their legal clinic had challenged the fraudulent reports in regulatory hearings, and how the community had ultimately succeeded in blocking the mining project and protecting their water supply. What made the difference wasn't just our technical expertise or legal resources, Claire explained. What made the difference was that we believed the ranchers when they said something was wrong with the water quality assessments, and we had the knowledge and tools to help them prove it. Similar stories had played out in dozens of communities over the past 5 years, each representing not just environmental protection, but also community empowerment and democratic participation in decisions affecting local environments. The foundation had helped fishing communities in Alaska challenge fraudulent assessments of proposed offshore drilling, worked with Native American tribes to expose consulting fraud affecting sacred lands, and supported urban communities fighting fraudulent air quality assessments that would have allowed polluting industries to expand in residential neighborhoods. The common thread in all these cases, Claire said, is that someone in the community knew something was wrong, but they didn't have the technical knowledge or legal resources to challenge expert opinions. Our job isn't to be the experts who make decisions for communities. Our job is to help communities access the expertise they need to make informed decisions for themselves. As Claire concluded her speech, the standing ovation lasted for several minutes. But what moved me most was not the applause but the expressions on people's faces. These were environmental professionals who'd spent their careers feeling isolated in their integrity, often pressured to compromise their standards and uncertain whether their individual actions could make meaningful differences. Claire had shown them that they were part of a much larger community of people committed to the same principles, and that together they could create systemic changes that none of them could achieve alone. After the speech, dozens of environmental professionals approached Claire with stories of their own struggles with consulting fraud, requests for foundation support, and offers to volunteer their expertise for community protection work. The conversation continued for hours, spilling out of the auditorium and into the convention center's corridors as people shared experiences and formed new connections. "This is what I hoped would happen," Claire told me as we finally made our way to the reception that evening. Not just people listening to speeches, but people realizing they're part of a movement that's much bigger than any individual organization or campaign. The reception was held in a ballroom overlooking the Columbia River, and as the evening progressed, I found myself moving through conversations with environmental scientists from across the continent, all of them connected by shared commitment to professional integrity and community empowerment. These were people who'd chosen meaningful work over lucrative careers, who'd risked professional retaliation to protect environments and communities, who'd found purpose in fighting corruption rather than just documenting ecological decline. Helen joined me near the windows overlooking the river as the reception wound down, and we stood watching the lights of Portland reflected in the dark water, while Claire continued conversations with colleagues and supporters. "Do you remember what Claire was like that night she called us?" Helen asked quietly. I did remember. The broken voice, the sense of betrayal and hopelessness, the feeling that everything she'd worked for had been destroyed by people she'd trusted. It was hard to reconcile that memory with the confident, purposeful woman who'd just addressed 2,000 environmental professionals about transforming systematic corruption into opportunities for community empowerment. "She's become someone I wouldn't have imagined was possible," I said. "Not because she's famous or successful, but because she figured out how to turn the worst experience of her life into something that helps other people." As we drove back to Claire's house that evening, she was quiet, processing the day's conversations and the commitments people had made to expand the Foundation's work into new regions and new areas of environmental protection. "What are you thinking about?" Helen asked from the passenger seat. Claire was quiet for another moment before answering. "I keep thinking about that phone call I made to Dad 5 years ago. How desperate and hopeless I felt. How convinced I was that my career was over and there was nothing I could do about it." She paused at a red light, looking out at the city lights surrounding us. If someone had told me that night that in 5 years I'd be running a national organization, speaking to thousands of environmental professionals, and helping communities across the country fight environmental fraud, I would have thought they were delusional. I turned to look at her from the back seat, seeing both the confident advocate who'd spoken that day and the frightened young woman who'd called us for help 5 years earlier. "What do you think made the difference?" I asked. Claire considered the question as the light changed and we continued toward her neighborhood. "I think the difference was realizing that I wasn't alone, that there were other people who cared about the same things I cared about, who were willing to take risks to protect environments and communities. Once I understood that, fighting back stopped feeling impossible and started feeling inevitable." We spent the next morning at Claire and James's house, a modest craftsman bungalow in southeast Portland, with a garden full of native plants and a workshop where James built furniture from reclaimed wood. It was exactly the kind of home I'd imagined Claire would create, simple and comfortable, but clearly oriented toward values more meaningful than material accumulation. Over breakfast, Claire and James walked us through their plans for the Foundation's next phase of development. The success of the Environmental Integrity Summit had generated funding commitments that would allow them to establish regional offices in 10 additional states, launch new programs focused on climate change fraud, and expand their international work through the Global Environmental Integrity Alliance. "The challenge now," James explained, "is maintaining the community focus that's been central to the Foundation's success while scaling up to meet national and international demand for our services." It was a familiar tension for successful advocacy organizations, the balance between growth and mission integrity. But Claire had clearly thought deeply about how to navigate this challenge. "We're not trying to become a huge organization that works on every environmental issue," she said. "We're trying to build a network of community-rooted organizations that share methodologies, resources, and support systems. The Foundation's role is to be a hub that helps local environmental integrity work flourish, not a centralized organization that tries to control everything." This approach reflected lessons Claire had learned from her experience with Cascade Solutions, where centralized control had enabled systematic corruption. The Foundation's model was deliberately decentralized, with regional offices operating independently while sharing resources and coordinating strategies through regular communication and joint planning processes. "What we've learned," Claire explained, "is that environmental protection works best when it emerges from communities that understand their local environments and have the knowledge and resources to protect them. Our job is to provide that knowledge and those resources, not to make decisions for communities." As Helen and I prepared to drive back to Cedar Heights that afternoon, Claire walked us to the car with an expression that reminded me of her childhood farewells, reluctant to see us leave but excited about whatever came next. "Thank you," she said simply, hugging us both, "for driving to Portland that night, for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself, for supporting the Foundation's work even when you weren't sure where it was leading." Helen wiped her eyes as she hugged Claire goodbye. "We're proud of you, sweetheart. Not because of what you've accomplished, but because of who you've become." As we drove away, I looked back at Claire and James standing in front of their house, waving goodbye with the kind of contentment that comes from building a life around meaningful work. The broken young woman who'd called us crying 5 years earlier had not just recovered from professional betrayal, she'd transformed it into purpose that extended far beyond her individual career or personal vindication. The Environmental Integrity Foundation would continue growing, the fight against environmental fraud would expand to new regions and new challenges, and Claire would undoubtedly face new obstacles and opponents as her work threatened more powerful interests. But sitting in that restored wetland 5 years earlier, surrounded by evidence of what was possible when good people refused to be silent, I'd felt confident that she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly the work the world needed her to do. That confidence had only grown stronger as I'd watched the Foundation's work evolve and expand. Environmental protection was no longer something that happened to communities from the outside. It was becoming something that communities did for themselves with support from allies who understood that protecting environments meant empowering the people who lived closest to them. The midnight phone call that had woken us 5 years earlier had indeed been the beginning, not the end, of Claire's story. But more than that, it had been the beginning of a movement that was transforming how environmental protection actually worked in practice, creating space for scientific integrity and community empowerment in systems that had been captured by narrow economic interests. Sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal isn't revenge, but transformation. Claire had taken the worst experience of her professional life and turned it into a force for protecting the environments and communities she cared about. She'd lost a job, but she'd found a calling that was far more meaningful than any career could have been. And as Helen and I drove back toward Cedar Heights, past forests and rivers that were now better protected because of the Foundation's work, I understood that Claire's transformation was really just the beginning of something much larger. The next generation of environmental professionals would enter their careers knowing that scientific integrity was not just a personal value but a collective commitment, that environmental protection was not just about regulatory compliance but about community empowerment, and that fighting corruption was not a career risk but a professional responsibility. The phone call that had broken Claire's voice 5 years earlier had ultimately helped her find it, stronger and clearer than ever before. And that voice was now part of a chorus that was changing how environmental protection actually worked, creating space for the kind of honest, community-rooted advocacy that could make real differences in real places for real people. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.